Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Hello there, I'm Don Shelley. Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Glad you could join us today. Very happy to be joined today by a special guest host, a friend of the family, but also someone who has a fellow passion for the topic that we're going to be talking about today. That's Ryan Cole. Ryan, glad to have you with us.
Thanks, it's good to be here.
Good. I want to tell the readers a little bit about who you are, your background, because I think of you as a modern Renaissance man, Ryan.
I have been all over the map, I guess. That's a euphemism, I suppose, for somebody who just can't stay focused on one thing too long. But I'll take Renaissance man. So, as of right now, I'm pursuing a degree in civil engineering, and I'm currently working as a paid intern at an engineering company here in Houston. Prior to that, I was a public school teacher for 5 years, and I taught music as well as math and science. I do have a master's degree in music. I've had a number of odd jobs. I've driven school buses. I've been a political reporter for a newspaper. And somehow in between all that, I've been a baseball fan for a long time. My dad is to blame or to thank. I'm not sure which.
Probably a little of both.
Yeah, for that. And grew up going to Astros games in the Dome, cheering for the Killer Bees, BGO, Bagwell, and the others. Kind of got out of it when I was in high school. That's when I got a little more into academics and the artsy stuff and all that, and all the jock stuff wasn't cool anymore. But back in there, 04, 05 playoff runs, got back into it again and have been diving more deeply ever since.
I appreciate you joining us here today, Ryan. Ryan's a close family friend. Ryan mentioned his dad, who's one of my good friends. And when I was thinking about this topic, I actually suggested maybe both of them might be able to join us. We're recording today on Father's Day, so your dad can't be with us. He'll certainly join us on a future episode because he has wide and varied interests. They also overlap to a great degree with mine, so I know that I'll have him on. But I thought Ryan would be perfect today because the topic of today's podcast is actually going to be, as we look at an alternative history where the integration of baseball happens a little bit differently than what we're accustomed to. Most of us are familiar with April 15th of 1947 being an important date, not only in sports history, not only in baseball history, but in American history, as Jackie Robinson takes the field for the Brooklyn Dodgers and breaks the color barrier in Major League Baseball. And just sort of to say this now because I think it's an important thing to say as we talk about alternatives here and other what ifs. We are not taking anything at all away from Jackie Robinson and what he did. Jackie, the bravery, the courage, the skill, just all kinds of things that are there have been well documented. And so our purpose here is not to suggest anything that diminishes the role of the position that we think of with respect to Jackie Robinson. Again, not only for those of us that, like myself, who are baseball nuts and baseball historical nuts, but also just in terms of what that meant for our country. But what a lot of people don't know because of the Jackie Robinson story is things could have turned out differently.
Yes.
And probably the first place that we would think of a potential different path, actually, when we jump into the Wayback Machine, we've got to go back further than 1947. We've got to go back to the late 19th century, and we're going to meet an interesting guy.
Yeah.
Ryan, tell us a little bit about Moses Fleetwood Walker.
Well, he himself was a bit of a Renaissance man as well. So Moses Fleetwood Walker was born in Ohio in a town called Mount Pleasant. And he was born, I believe, there's some dispute about his birth date, but it was either 1856 or 57. And he was born to his parents, his dad was a physician and later became a minister. And he had a few siblings, and one of them was his brother Weldy. We'll come back to him a little bit later on. They moved to Steubenville, another town. This is kind of eastern Ohio, not too far from the border with Pennsylvania. Moved there when he was still pretty young. And pretty early on, when he got to early adulthood or his late adolescent period, he started to get into baseball. And he was a pretty good hitter. He was a catcher for the most part. And as we talk about his catching, there's something I want to point out too about that catching then was different than what we think about it now.
Yeah, but baseball then was different.
Was different overall too, that's right. So one of the main ways in which it was different, there are a couple of things to point out, I guess, but one of them is that the catchers didn't really wear any gear. So nowadays when you look at catchers, they have the biggest mitt, the thickest mitt out of everybody playing. They didn't have any mitt at all back then.
In fact, nobody really had any gloves at all either.
That's right, yeah. And you can probably get by a little bit more easily with that if you're, playing left field, but when you're, catching throws from the pitch, it's a little bit different. So no gear at all, no helmets, no pads, nothing. On top of that, the pitching mound was a little bit closer back then, too. And, of course, the ball was different. It's not the ball that we have today. But it was anywhere from 5 to 10 feet closer out here. So he played a pretty tough position that was pretty physically demanding of people at the time. So he went off to college. He came from pretty well-educated parents, a well-educated family. And he went off to college, and he was a very good academic when he was there. But his grades kind of started to slip as he got a little more into the baseball, got a little bit more involved with that team, and became a star athlete on the baseball team there. So he's playing in college and doing very well, one of the best hitters on the team. And one summer, in between semesters, he is playing for the semi-pro team.
So let's talk a little bit about even how baseball,
Sure.
the way the game was played was different then.
Yeah.
The organization of baseball was different then.
Yeah.
It's been argued that the Civil War spreads baseball. There were different styles of baseball that were sort of existing in different parts of the country. We sort of get this standardized form that we think of today. The rules are generally agreed, but they're also a little vary from region to region and play to play. And we, during this period of time, is the first time that we're seeing the advent, you said semi-professional, people actually being paid for the game.
Yeah, because early on it was really just an amateur thing. This was just a social thing you would do for fun. It was not anything anyone would do for a profession, necessarily.
Sort of gentlemen's clubs would have maybe a baseball team, and they would schedule a match with another club and their team, and you sort of had like club baseball.
Yeah. Then
you started having it as a collegiate sport, even if it wasn't sort of a sanctioned sport. The NCAA, as we know them, didn't exist then. So the various universities had teams. But we also didn't have what we think of today as even being the major leagues. There was not an organized system for league baseball. So a lot of these were barnstorming or almost ad hoc games that these professional teams would play. That's what I understand. Is that what you understand as well?
Yeah, something along those lines.
Yeah. So when we say that one summer he's doing this, it's not like he's gone to play for the for the Yankees farm club and he's working his way up to playing in New York, for example.
Right. And in fact, as we'll see a little bit later on too, there's even some flexibility within the leagues, kind of akin to how soccer is outside the U.S. nowadays, where teams can be moved up and down within the leagues. So he's in college, playing college ball. In the summer, he goes off to play for the White Sewing Machine Company of Cleveland. Now, that word white is not a racial denotation. That was the name of the person that founded the company. I don't know if the sewing machines were white. That's something I didn't investigate. But that's the name of the company he was playing for. And I think he was getting paid for this, but he was definitely one of the ringers that they brought in for this. And, he grew up in the North and in Ohio at this time. From my impression was that it was a pretty good upbringing for him. I don't think growing up he experienced a lot of racial discrimination. I think he had maybe not an idyllic childhood, but something that was certainly not comparable with a lot of the former slaves in the South. Growing up in a similar time.
Even though he was born before the Civil War and is coming to adulthood in the period after the war and during Reconstruction.
Right, and something we should have pointed out too is the place he was born, Mount Pleasant, was a way station along the Underground Railroad. So it was somewhere that was going to be a little bit more safe for African Americans during this time. So we preface all this to talk about this team he plays with in the summer, and they're going down to Louisville, Kentucky. This is August 21st of 1881, and they're going to play against a team called the Eclipse. And this is the first time that he really encounters some racism. During this game, he was not really supposed to be starting, which I guess was sort of the terms of agreement for this other team to play against them. But the other catcher got hurt pretty early on. Again, who would figure when you're catching
with no gear,
with no gear, no glove, nothing at all. So the first string catcher, or the other catcher, I should say, got hurt, and so Walker's planning to come in, and basically the other team is refusing to allow him. They're saying they're not going to play. There are players on the Eclipse that leave the field, that completely refuse to play if Walker comes in. And so what eventually ends up happening is he doesn't play. He sits that one out. The third baseman comes in and plays catcher, and lo and behold, the White Sewing Machine Company loses that game. So it's kind of his first encounter with this sort of discriminatory practice that's documented that we're aware of. So things move on. He goes on to the University of Michigan a little bit later on. Is a star catcher on that team. He's hitting leadoff. He's a guy that's known to hit for power, hit for average. And even beyond his offensive prowess, he's a guy who's known primarily as a defensive catcher, one of the best that's in the area. So he's doing so well that in 1883, he's actually signed by Toledo. And Toledo at that time was just a minor league team. They had a team called the Blue Stockings. And he signed on and has a very good year for them, does very well in 1883. And I believe it's also that year, let me just double check this here, that he encounters Cap Anson. Yeah, that's right. So Cap Anson, do you want to say a bit about Cap Anson and his stature at the time?
Before doing any of the research here, and as a baseball fan, and having Cap Anson was a name that I was familiar with. He was a
he was in The Simpsons.
So there you go. So
he was on Mr. Burns' team.
So there you go. For that reason alone, we ought to know who he is.
Yeah.
But he's a white player. Obviously, he's a player manager. He happens to be playing for the team, the Chicago White Stockings, that we will eventually become and we will think of as being the Chicago Cubs.
Yes.
And they are a member of the, if I remember correctly, they are actually a member of the, are they a member of the American Association?
They're in the National League, yes.
But the Blue Stockings are in the American Association.
They will be in 84.
That's correct.
Yes,
and this
so
is where things
is
where things are going to come to a head.
Yes.
And so the American Association is actually still exists today. It's just the overarching body for what we think of as most of minor league baseball today because of future agreements after the major leagues, the modern major leagues as we come to know them, the National and the American League, come into being. But as we draw towards 84, the American Association is considered to be one of the top tier leagues for professional players. And so Cap Anson is the player manager for one of the teams in that. That's the White Stockings. And that's where, I'll let you finish this out, that's where now we have Walker encountering not just the opposition that he saw in that event you described back in 1983, but now even more of a precursor opposition to the fact that he would even be playing in this league.
Right. The difference, of course, being here that Cap Anson was a monumental figure in baseball at the time and is still revered as what he did on the field as being one of the best players. Obviously, with the character issues and the virulent racism, we are aware of that, and we take that into factor when we talk about him as an overall person.
We like the way Ty Cobb plays, even if we don't like Ty Cobb, for example.
Yes, absolutely. So this is the first time he's really encountering that on a larger scale. And it basically plays out as you would expect. Cap Anson says his team won't play. He uses some very derogatory language to refer to Moses Fleetwood Walker. Eventually, however, they do play the game, but this is the first time we see him at this level of baseball, this sort of discrimination happening, where there's an attempt by an African American to be a player on what would be considered a major league team or play against a major league team, and he's met with some very harsh resistance. So we have that in 1883. The great thing about Toledo that year is they had such a good year in 1883 that they were actually inducted into the American Association the following year. So they're moving up. Things are looking good in Toledo. However, now that Toledo's part of the American Association, this counts as major leagues at the time. This is the first major league team that has an African American player. And in fact, Moses Fleetwood Walker makes his debut on May 1st of that year. And he doesn't have such a great first game. What I saw is that he went 0 for 4, and he had 4 errors, which is incredible that a catcher of all people could accrue 4 errors in a game. But it may not be quite so surprising when we look at some of the resistance he even encountered on his own team.
Right.
It's kind of funny to look at one of their great pitchers, Tony Mullane, who I think went on to have a pretty good career and was renowned as one of the better pitchers of the 19th century. But he was an excellent pitcher, and Tony Mullane loved the way that Moses Fleetwood Walker caught. He thought he was a great catcher, had great things to say about him, but still hated him because he was black. And so one of the underhanded things that Mullane would do was that when Walker was catching him, Walker would give a signal for maybe a curveball, and Mullane would intentionally throw him a fastball. And he would intentionally cross up signals with him. And so you can imagine that if your pitcher is always deliberately throwing the opposite or something different from your sign, it's going to make your stat line look bad.
Right.
So that's something that I like to keep in mind too when we look at Walker's stats is, at least on Baseball Reference, I know he had exactly 0.0 WAR. But if his defense is being crippled by and sabotaged by his own teammates, you can kind of see how that sort of thing might happen. So that aside, he did have some support from his teammates and from his coaches. He did not have some support from his teammates as well. But the main thing that derailed his career is that he kept encountering injuries. In that year, he only played in 42 games. He did play one game in the outfield and 41 at catcher, but only 42 games. Of course, they didn't play the long season we play nowadays, but they still played, I believe, over 100 games. So he appeared in, not even half of his team's games that year. So after that, should we keep going about Moses Fleetwood Walker? Do you want to interject with anything?
Just to say that because of what happened in that year, 42 games, by the way, 42 is a significant number. We were talking about this before we started recording.
Yes.
If you go to a Major League Baseball game today or watch one on TV on April 15th, while you're finishing your taxes, you probably have the ball game on. I've done that more than once. Sure. But you'll notice that every player on the field, or it used to be just select players, now it's every player on the field, is wearing the same uniform number. The uniform number that they're wearing is
42.
And the reason they're doing that is to honor Jackie Robinson. That was his number. That is the only number that is retired across all of Major League Baseball. Yep. So there'll be no other players after that. That was done a little over a decade ago, I guess. No other players that will wear that. There were a couple that were grandfathered in that also wore it.
Very famously.
Mariano Rivera being one of them. But it's interesting to note that when you see that 42, and I think you pointed this out to me, I'd never realized this. Yeah. It is to honor Robinson. I like that. We should do that. But the next time you see that game with 42, remember that happens to be the number of Major League games that Moses Fleetwood Walker played. And as you pointed out, the reason that he didn't play more than that primarily was due to injury, but it was also due to all that had happened that year because of him actually playing in the games. The movement began behind the scenes to formalize the fact that there are not going to be any other players like Walker.
Right.
He's not going to be welcome back if he's recovered from the injuries, and we're not going to have other players.
Right.
And Cap Anson, who we mentioned before, is one of the major proponents of this. Yep. And there ultimately comes to be what's known as the Gentleman's Agreement, where all of the major league clubs agree we are not going to field teams that include African American players.
Right.
And so that ends what could have been, and this is actually going to be our split in history at this point, which is imagining the scenario that if that had not happened, Walker comes back from injury, continues to play. Mm-hmm. Of course, other African American players probably would come along. Teams like to compete. They'd be looking for the best talent.
Yes. And
so you have a scenario where it's maybe gradual. We don't know exactly how it would play out. We'll talk about that.
Right.
But where you don't have this absolute no that exists for, as far as major leagues are concerned, there will be no African American players.
Right. And I said we would come back to his brother Weldy. I should have mentioned that his brother Weldy joined him on that team. So both Moses Fleetwood Walker and his brother were the first two African Americans to play baseball.
And even for the lower leagues here, this led me to do a lot of reading on something I was generally familiar with, having been a fan of history, but also a fan of baseball. Those two things, a wonderful collision for me, was the realization that for a lot of these teams, you mentioned the sewing machine team, they were in this to make a little money if they could in doing so. And so fielding the best team wasn't about necessarily respecting a color line or whatever's there. There was a financial interest here that often green trumps black or white for a lot of folks. And so it's interesting to think that probably would have come along as well. Yeah. But what we do have after his injuries, after the situation there, and then the so-called Gentleman's Agreement, is we have the end of, except for a few exceptions where people worked around the edges or claimed that they were maybe Cuban instead of black. Right. This type of thing.
But he would have been the last openly black player who identified as black, who other people saw as black, and was, for whatever it meant at that time, was treated as black. He was the last one to play
in the major leagues until Jackie Robinson in 1947. Yep. So we have a period there of roughly, let's just call it 60 years. Yeah. Where there is a growing popularity of what is becoming America's pastime. Yeah. but America's pastime at the professional level, at the most elite level, is missing complete element of the ethnic makeup of the country, and that's African Americans. And so what we're going to explore then is the alternatives again of, let's assume, and our assumption will be, there's lots of ways we could do this. We'll assume that Walker comes back and that other players follow. And so in my mind, the most likely scenario that makes sense to talk about reasonably, it would not have been a sudden influx of African American players, but with the open door and the quality of talent and the search for talent that continues to go on, particularly as the leagues begin to compete, the sport becomes more popular, money becomes a bigger issue, ultimately leading to the American leagues, to the formation of the American League to challenge the National League, the major leagues as we know them. There would be this slow integration that would continue to cause a more steady stream of certainly the highest quality African American players would have found their ways onto the teams that we still recognize the names of today. So that's the path that we'll go down there. So who are some of the great players in Negro Leagues? We'll use that term. We'll come back and talk about that a little bit more later. But who are some of the greatest players that we think of today as being Negro League players, meaning they never had the chance to actually play in the white major leagues?
If we pick one from the pitching side and one from the position player side, I think you have to talk about Satchel Paige as the pitcher and about Josh Gibson as a position player.
Josh Gibson's fascinating to me. We were having this conversation again before we started recording. I think it's true that if you went to most people who weren't baseball fans like you and I are and asked them who was the greatest player of all time, you probably get the answer Babe Ruth. If you go to most baseball fans, you may get a slightly different answer, but you also probably get the same answer, which is Babe Ruth. And the reason for that is we know him as the guy, the big sort of funny looking sort of fat guy
with the little legs,
spinning legs that we see on early motion pictures. But before, he was the guy that was crushing home runs after the end of the dead ball era, and of course held the record for career homers up until the 1970s, till he's passed by, interestingly enough, a former Negro League player, Hank Aaron. But Ruth was a Hall of Fame caliber pitcher before he was ever a hitter. So when you talk about the greatest players of all time, you probably go with Ruth, because Ruth as a hitter, one of the best ever. Ruth as a pitcher, one of the best ever. He's all together. But so if you break it down to hitters, let's look at Gibson for a while. Gibson, some people have actually the moniker that's been placed upon him is he's the Black Babe Ruth, because he's known for being a prodigious power hitter. Something on the order of what?
I've seen 800 to 1,000 home runs, and it's hard to know how many because record keeping for Negro Leagues was spotty. And of course, he played a lot of outside of just what the Negro League organization was, like you mentioned, with barnstorming or with other leagues and that kind of thing too. But then also just trying to find a way to compare what the level of play was like in the Negro Leagues with what it was like in the Major League Baseball at that time too. So I see somewhere in that range, enough to tell us that he could have at least been competition for Ruth and could have very possibly been a more prodigious home run hitter than Ruth.
I think his Hall of Fame plaque roughly just says 800 or more home runs because they don't know, and I think they're erring probably on the side of conservatism there, which tells you, and to put that in perspective, until Aaron broke the record, Ruth's record in the 70s, the record was 714. 800 is more than 714.
Indeed.
And so again, he sort of picks the moniker up of being the Black Babe Ruth. I've heard more than one baseball commentator, though we were talking about this earlier. How do they
say
turn
it
that
the
around?
other way, that Josh Gibson was not the Black Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth was the white Josh Gibson.
So. And of course, the difference there, again, thinking back to Walker and the position that he played, the other interesting thing about Gibson
is that he was a catcher.
He was a catcher, and so and a large physical specimen. Probably more looking like modern athletes that we think today in so many ways. And so played.
He didn't look like a guy that got by on hot dogs and soda pop.
or a beer, or whatever Ruth managed to do.
And the point of that positional discussion too, if we have listeners who are not baseball fans, the idea being that it's much more difficult to find someone who can be a catcher and hit really well because the defensive demands of that position are much greater than someone like Babe Ruth, who was a right fielder. And
the reason I bring that up in the context of this alternate history is if you're looking for reasons that clubs still not overly comfortable with having a large number of African American players, or they're only going to select, if you will, the cream of the crop to bring them into major leagues.
Yeah.
You can't help but look and go, there's a guy who plays catcher who can hit.
Yep.
That's something that's in demand today as we sit here in 2019.
Absolutely.
That was definitely in demand all the way back in baseball history. And so it's in an alternative universe. When, in fact, Gibson died sadly of a brain aneurysm, sort of at a relatively young age, 36.
Yeah.
About the period of time that Robinson was coming. There's you can imagine a scenario where if Gibson had not died an untimely death, he might have actually...
He would have played some point in the
at some
major
point,
leagues.
so we actually may have seen what it would have been like to really have Gibson face major league pitching and seeing what that would have looked like. Although he did that informally in a number of the barnstorming games.
Right.
Probably a good idea just to interject what we mean by barnstorming here. What did happen a lot was that baseball in the particularly in the first part of the 20th century, but then in the teens, the 20s, and even particularly into the 30s and the 40s, before money really started coming into the game for a lot of players, the idea that you were a Major League Baseball player and as a result you were set for life and had this massive multi-million-dollar contract, that's a very modern notion.
Yes.
A lot of Major League players, even as late as the early 70s, worked jobs in the off season, even if they were major league caliber players.
Yep.
And so in the 30s, particularly, I guess the heyday of this was in the 20s, 30s, and up until World War II, so up until like 1940, is that during the off season, it was not uncommon for major league players, Babe Ruth,
very famous.
just pick any Gehrig, Lou Gehrig. I don't know why I'm mentioning a bunch of Yankees here because I'm not a Yankees fan, but for non-baseball listeners, they would probably understand these go. Very often during the off season, they would go on these organized barnstorming tours, where instead of playing as a Yankee, they were playing as a mercenary free agent, taking the game to where the major leagues weren't at that time, which was not in the South and not in the West, and going and putting on exhibition games, and in some cases making more money playing in these paid exhibition games than they were for their regular job with the major league club.
Yeah.
And among what would happen in these barnstorming arrangements is often those were white teams playing white teams, collections of talent, but very often this was where we have the chance to see the quality talent from the Negro Leagues at the time and the quality talent from the white major leagues playing each other, because they arranged games between Negro League players and between Major League players. So we have this sampling of the players getting to see each other, and a lot of what we know, the comments they make about each other relates to actually having seen them play there, because otherwise they didn't. But that also we see from what little statistical data exists between those games that it wasn't always the Major League team prevailing easily. The talent, at least at the elite level, seemed to be pretty evenly matched.
Right. And if we're kind of exploring that area with Josh Gibson specifically already, to your point about how Major League players didn't make the kind of money that we think of them making today, doing something like winning the World Series or winning the pennant was a big deal. There was a big bonus that came with that, and there was a strong incentive to do so. And so if the league had been opened up earlier by someone like Moses Fleetwood Walker, it would have made signing someone like Josh Gibson very attractive to a number of teams. And that is something that very likely could have and would have happened at some point.
So we do have that possibility of thinking through, again, just individual players there, and we could probably easily go through a list of those players.
Yeah.
Some of them more popularly known for those of us that are baseball geeks. We know who they are and others don't. But this idea that exists of the fact that there were players who had the talent and were capable of playing at the major league level is sort of without doubt.
Right.
Gibson, we've talked about here as a hitter. Satchel Paige as a pitcher.
Yeah.
What do you want to say about Satchel?
He was one of a kind. Major League Baseball was at a loss not only for what he would have contributed on the field as a baseball player, but just his personality. He was just such an intriguing guy he was almost sort of a Yogi Berra-esque kind of guy, which I guess is pertinent to this podcast too. Yeah. With these just little witticisms, these quirky things he would say, but just a very smart guy and an excellent pitcher, and he would have been a great contribution to the culture.
And in fact, in Satchel Paige's instance, he did actually
pitch in Major League Baseball when he was older.
Yeah. He's actually in his 40s, and we were talking a little bit about some of his, not getting off into the stat part of this, which I'm sure a lot of our listeners don't care about.
Right.
But for a 40-year-old pitcher in that era,
right.
He put up some numbers that were not just respectable, but a little bit better than respectable.
Yeah.
And so here is Satchel, arguably 15 years out of his prime, who's still able to get out major league hitters.
Yeah.
At a pace that makes you go, what would Satchel in his prime had actually done if the opportunity would have existed?
Yeah.
So it's easy. We could probably talk for hours. We may do that some other time, just on a bonus episode about these players that we don't know about. But just from those two examples, and there are certainly others, Oscar Charleston, Cool Papa Bell, Buck Leonard. I mean, we can go on and name a lot of these folks. If any of you have seen Ken Burns' Baseball, which if you haven't, even if you're not a baseball fan per se, he weaves in a lot of the story of society around what happens with baseball.
Right. And I'll throw this in, too, that if you're ever in Kansas City, check out the Negro Leagues Museum there. It's also right next to the Jazz Museum there, too, so you kind of get a two for an.
So for you, there's baseball
That's
and music,
right.
man.
I don't know why I haven't moved there yet.
Yeah, exactly. And I understand the barbecue there is also pretty good.
It's quite good, yes.
Yeah. So one of the easy sort of hypothetical what-ifs are these players that we never saw in the major leagues that would have perhaps held records, and we would be looking at their real numbers and knowing, well, was Gibson an 800 home run guy? Maybe not, but if he's a 500 home run guy, that's
very impressive.
That's very impressive.
Yeah.
And so we would have that as well. So that's sort of the easy part of the what if, is there would have been this influx of talent. Now the flip side of that would be, even as late as 1947 with Robinson's integration, the major leagues are not 30 teams. The major leagues are 16 teams, 8 teams in each league, still 25-man rosters.
Yeah.
So the number of quote-unquote major league jobs that exist is still fairly limited.
Yeah.
You're talking roughly about 400 at any one given time, 400 rostered active players in the major leagues. Now, it is true the minor leagues were much deeper then. We talked today about the various, AAA, AA, A-ball. They went down to D-ball as late as the 1950s, so there were a lot more minor league teams.
Yeah.
But it's another implication. The alternative would have been African-American players, particularly the elite players. So let's say, for every Gibson and Page that's in the league, who's not in the league?
Right.
Some other guy.
Yeah. And that, I guess, can lead to a discussion we didn't really talk about earlier, but now I'm curious is, if you had all this influx of black talent that was major league worthy, perhaps something that could have happened earlier was expansion.
That's a good point. It's amazing to me because I was born in the late 60s, and so this is after most of the early part of what's called the expansion era has happened or happened shortly after that.
Yeah.
Certainly the Dodgers and the Giants had moved from the East Coast to the West Coast. So, my landscape, my geographic map of baseball, in fact, the room that we're recording in right now has a map that shows where franchises are and where stadiums are. Couldn't help but notice it as we're talking about that. Goes from coast to coast. But certainly at the time of the turn of the century, the early part of the 20th century, professional baseball as we know it is concentrated in the Northeast. I was looking at one point, even as late as 47, at the time that Robinson breaks the color barrier. You can arguably, it's not quite true for the southernmost team, but you can make the argument because they're like neck and neck with Kansas City.
Yeah.
That the southern and westernmost team in all of baseball is St. Louis.
Yeah.
So the lower left-hand corner of the baseball map is St. Louis, Missouri.
Yeah.
It doesn't go anywhere beyond that.
Yeah.
I think that's an excellent point. If you had more talent available, would there have been the earlier move towards expanding the game just because talent would have forced the expansion?
And then you can look at the wider repercussions of that too, of then maybe that stimulates the economic move more into the western part of the country and become more of a coast-to-coast kind of country rather than just so much focused on the East Coast as it was for so long.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. So you can think about what would have perhaps been resentment, the type of thing that would have pushed back against more and more integration, more and more African-American players coming into the game, would have been the marginal white players who are losing their jobs or that remain in the minors, aren't able to stay gainfully employed in quote-unquote professional baseball. But it may have gone in the other direction, which is we're gonna grow the game. We need more jobs so that there's room for everybody. These guys that we think of as being and have If you go to Baseball Reference, they have major league statistics that I just know them as a name. I have no idea who that guy was as a player. Not that they might not have played, they just may have played for the San Francisco Seals.
Yeah.
Not in the Pacific Coast League, which was not a major league, but that was the expansion team in 1931 to the West Coast for the National League or something like that. And so you might have seen, as you point out, a different scenario with the structure of baseball as we know it today, the economics of that, but particularly the geographic structure, could have been very different under that scenario.
Yeah.
So for me, one of the interesting things that also sort of comes up there in the alternative is what did exist in the real timeline, in the real world, were the Negro Leagues. So these grew to be primarily the 20s and the 30s and into the 40s, the period of time that we think of being the dominant age of Negro League baseball. And these were black-owned, black-run leagues and teams and franchises that, of course, employed black players playing in parallel to Major League Baseball. So in many towns, for example, they used the same stadiums that the Major League teams used. They just used them when the Major League clubs weren't there. In fact, one of the dirty little secrets, if you will, of the period of segregation in baseball is that the Major League clubs were making money off of the Negro League clubs for renting out the stadiums that they needed for size. Okay, our team's not here, so we'll let you play.
Right.
And that was actually one of the things that was going on. And as I read more and got into that more, I knew something about it before preparing for the podcast here. But there were a number of different black-owned businesses during the period from Reconstruction forward, the period of segregation, even into the 50s and 60s, roughly what we sometimes call the Jim Crow era. There was a lot of black-owned businesses. The Negro Leagues were one of the most, if not the most profitable, one of the most prominent displays of black entrepreneurship, black management of businesses. The leagues often are looked at by some antagonistic commentators as well. From year to year, the franchises tended to fold and tended to move. But a lot of that was they had tremendous obstacles to overcome. Again, just having a place to play.
Right. It
was tough to schedule because of putting these schedules together that worked for that. Travel was still difficult in a lot of places.
Yeah.
If you've seen the recent Oscar-winning movie Green Book,
yeah.
You can have an appreciation. That's not in 1920.
Right.
that's happening. So
right.
There were various parts of the country that was still difficult for just the things that we take for granted today to happen. So if you have blacks in Major League Baseball, one of the questions is, do you even have the formation of the Negro Leagues?
Right. And so I guess there are a couple ways you can look at it. One, that if the Negro Leagues never exist, then that's a strong black institution that was a great place for racial pride and a great way for African Americans to practice their business acumen and to become very strong in that regard. But if that were gone, then also you are more likely to have some kind of integration happening earlier. So it was good that it was there because it gave African Americans an outlet to do the things at which they excelled so well, and certainly on comparable levels to what whites were doing at the time. But then without that, if there were not a need for that, then that would probably imply there was some sort of integration that happened earlier,
right,
that obviated that need for the Negro Leagues.
And so the first place that you sort of go to is that a good thing or a bad thing? The answer probably is
both.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's no doubt that the socioeconomic impact of the Negro Leagues is documented. I read tons of articles from not just baseball historians, but economic historians and others talking about the value of that. How in many towns they sort of overlapped with black media. Mm-hmm. Being able to be better supported because they were reporting about the baseball team. Same thing happened in Major League Baseball with non black media, in the sense of how there was this interesting play back and forth between the sports franchise and the newspaper and the sports franchise.
Yep.
To the point that sometimes there was often the comment made about that those relationships were a little too close at times in terms of what we think of as being modern journalism or modern reporting. But I think you raise an interesting point of it doesn't necessarily mean that it was a good thing, because absent that, there would have been other outlets potentially for those same people that had some of those same skills that just happened to be African American. They gravitated towards Negro League Baseball because they could do that. That was there. It was an opportunity, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have done something else that might not have been more meaningful or more important.
Sure. And that's, I guess, one thing, too, or another way you can look at it as Negro League Baseball being another iteration of the idea of separate but equal.
Right.
Which we know, of course, was not equal. And so that's one way I guess I could think about its abolition not being the worst thing in the world, because, you know, it was a great thing for so many of these players and for the entrepreneurs and everything, but ultimately it was supporting this idea that was untenable, basically. I don't think our country could have survived with this idea of separate but equal, and obviously it didn't with our eventual integration. So it's an interesting way to look at it, I guess.
Yeah, and of course one of the things that went down the wonderful hyperlinked path of the internet, would go from one thing to another doing the research there, you know, the realization that I would actually find cogent, well-written, well-reasoned articles that suggested, you know, that 1947, the real integration by Jackie Robinson, was, yes, a good thing on one level. Symbolically, it's a very important thing. But on the other level, essentially it was a death knell for... It was the death... Eventually, it was very quickly the death knell for Negro League Baseball. In fact, there's only a few more years that it survives in nothing of the same form, because all the players who were capable of playing in the major leagues, once the door was open, major league teams were anxious to bring certainly that elite level talent in as quickly as they could. But then, you know, the point that was made was it's still, and arguably not even necessarily the case today, that you see inside of the major leagues black executives, black managers. At least one article that I read, which I don't think was militant, I think it was well reasoned and argued, was that essentially what happened in 1947 was a white Major League Baseball hostile takeover of the Negro Leagues. And that's, you know, you can argue and you can see both sides of an argument there, but the fact that there are both sides of that argument to be seen makes the case that may have been a result as well. And certainly if you'd had integration before, particularly thinking about Rube Foster, who was sort of known for being the catalyst behind the success of the Negro Leagues. Obviously, he was a skilled ball player, more skilled as a businessman. There's no doubt about that. Imagine a scenario where he's able to play in the major leagues and is able to get some type of foothold or toehold with the right organization in a position of management, or, you know, position of, it could be whatever it would be, to actually, there wouldn't just be talking about Jackie Robinson breaking the color barrier on the field in 1947. We'll be talking about
all the front offices.
Foster breaking the color barrier in the front office in 1932 or something like that as a result, which also would have been very different.
Sure.
And I think that's an interesting thing to explore.
Right. Because you can think, I guess, about too, you know, we were mentioning earlier that the rate of African Americans in Major League Baseball today is quite low. It's lower than the percentage of African Americans in the general population. And you can kind of speculate if an African American executive earlier on could have been in that position to promote that more, to make that something that was more idealized to young black boys growing up, that perhaps that could be very different today. And I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with the racial ratios of Major League Baseball today. I don't think it's necessarily discriminatory or anything like that. But I think it's always healthy when American institutions reflect the composition of America.
Right.
And I think that's something that would be good for Major League Baseball. And that's something that could have happened, certainly, if you had someone at the executive level who had more of that power to put more African Americans in those executive positions and to drum up more of that love of the game among that community.
Yeah, it was interesting to me in preparing for the podcast. I actually said, well, I'm just curious what the numbers are. I'm a numbers kind of guy.
Sure.
So I went back and found a site that went year by year by the ethnic breakdowns. It's interesting, 1947, it's slightly less than 1%. I know where that came from. That was Jackie Robinson.
Yeah.
And, of course, the league is very predominantly white or Anglo, whatever label that you want to put there. Today, it's approximately 7 to 8% of Major League Baseball players are black. It's not because the rest of the league is white.
Correct.
The rest, a huge portion of the league, somewhere between 40 and 42%, or Latino.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's been a change in the ethnic makeup. We could equally be doing a podcast if there was a Latin version of Moses Fleetwood Walker out there that could have integrated the game from a Latin standpoint, which also did not happen for a period of time. Let's be very clear. The major leagues existed from the late 19th century until, with a few exceptions, with Latin players who were deemed, I guess, white enough or Anglo-looking enough to be able to play. It wasn't until 47 the color line is broken, and that opens the door for Latinos. Baseball was very white during that period of time. But as we see it now, it's not that, again, 8% seems very low compared to what it had grown to, particularly in the 60s and the 70s. But it's not the result of whites taking back the game. It's the result of the influx of very, very, very talented Latino players and cultures outside of the United States that have embraced baseball to bring it along. In fact, you might argue it's not a decline of blacks in baseball as much as a decline of just Americans in baseball as a rule of thumb. And as a fan, and I don't have a problem with that because I like the internationalization of the game, the world nature of the game. But when you grow the talent pool and you get it outside of a very narrow subset of just your country, interesting things happen. Of course, the argument can also be made because of Robinson breaking the color barrier in baseball in 47. That opened up the color barrier in other sports. And we can certainly look at other leagues that exist in the United States that very much skew those numbers in another direction. The NFL, the National Basketball Association. Not so much the NHL, but that's a whole other thing. But we can see that the numbers there compared to the population are actually skewed in the other direction. There are more African Americans, for example, as a percentage in the NBA that's different than the representation of society as a whole. And there's still plenty of white fans that pack the seats. There seems to be no problem with that. Thankfully, we've evolved to a point that that's okay. But it's curious to think, again, back to our original premise here, if there's more openness in the 19-teens and the 1920s, what could have happened there? The other thing that really also jumps out at me is I still imagine a somewhat segregated and a society that's still struggling with the idea of racial equality and racial integration. But World War II is an interesting catalyst event in that it's not long after World War II, 47, that the game actually integrates. But one of the things that actually, as I was reading, was floated during the war to keep baseball alive was the question of maybe we let black players fill major league rosters. And so, one of the things I was thinking back in terms of an alternative here is as baseball loses some of its talent to the war, another possible catalyst would have there been a more open reception. Again, our idea here, we go back to Moses Fleetwood Walker, there's this gradual willingness to allow African Americans to play. That may have seen a further influx because of the war and because of the changes that are there that would have altered things, not just with one player coming in 47, but a lot of players coming in all of a sudden. We may have thought of the 40s as being a different, more integration of the game, segregation moving out of the game, but for a different reason than having this arbitrary decision we're going to break the color barrier. If that makes any sense. So anything else you've thought of here that's in the alternative path maybe that we haven't covered?
Well, we've spoken a lot about how this earlier breaking of the color barrier might have affected the baseball world. One of the greatest things about Jackie Robinson is not just that he helped baseball move forward, but that he helped the country move forward. And you mentioned that two of your great passions are baseball and history. And when these are both entwined and reflective of one another, that baseball is a microcosm of what's happening in our country as a whole. And he certainly wasn't the only reason, but I believe he was one of the major reasons when Jackie Robinson debuted in 47, that into the 50s and 60s, we start to see the resurgence of the civil rights movement. And we start to see a lot of things happening. And so I think the question that's worth exploring then too is if it had integrated in the 1880s when Moses Fleetwood Walker broke the color barrier, if we would have seen something similar to what we saw in the 50s and 60s happening in the 1890s or the first decade of the 1900s. Because we can look at the history post-Civil War and we know that we had Reconstruction. And Reconstruction was a period, and you're more of a history buff than I am, so feel free to jump in and add when you need. But, Reconstruction was this period where it was attempting to not just say, okay, well, all the slaves are freed now, but then to actually put them on an equal status with the rest of the American citizens, because they were citizens now. And so you have, 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, abolishing slavery, giving equal rights under the law, giving voting rights to at least black males at the time. But all these things where the idea was to make African Americans to equal citizens in the country. And Reconstruction lasted until about 77 or so, 1877.
Right.
And then we start to see a different period, a sort of a backlash. And sometimes this period is called redemption. And this is basically the idea of the southern states, most of them that were part of the Confederacy, effectively implementing Jim Crow and refusing to treat African Americans as equal citizens.
We know what the Constitution says, but we have other ways of accomplishing what we want
Yes.
to accomplish that, at least from our point of view, until the court rules otherwise, don't violate that.
Absolutely. And for a time, all of these amendments to the Constitution were martially enforced. But that could only last for so long. And it was eventually, once a lot of these troops are pulled out of the southern states, that they kind of get free reign and things go downhill from there. So part of the issue with, I think, why Moses Fleetwood Walker failed to integrate baseball, as Jackie did much later, is that this is a period of decline of civil rights for African Americans. This was not a period where things were moving up and looking better for them. Things have moved forward during Reconstruction, but now a lot of these rights are being rolled back. They were being reduced back to second-class citizens. I was just looking through a book of mine today, and just looking at some of the advertisements and the cartoons and depictions of African Americans during that time, and they're quite shocking. Or even to look at pictures of some of the lynchings from this era. And the lynchings themselves are graphic and disturbing, but what's maybe even more disturbing is to see on the faces of these white people smiles. And it's quite jarring. And so this is kind of the world, at least in the South, that was going on when Moses Fleetwood Walker was playing baseball. Right. So the idea being, though, of course, if he were successful then, would that still have been the case? And it's interesting to explore whether that would have gone on, or whether kind of what happened later on with the Harlem Renaissance and what happened with Jackie Robinson's era, if that could have been moved forward in time some. If what we think of as the Harlem Renaissance could have been happening not in 1925 but in 1895 or something like that.
Right.
And you can kind of extrapolate further from that and look at where race relations are today, and we could have been 40, 50, 60 years ahead of where we are now in terms of that, because there's obviously still work to be done now.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, in the sense that things tend to move in that realm, or that way of looking at things. They move from generation to generation. And at times they appear sudden because of an event that causes something to be sudden, but other times it tends to be gradual. And so the earlier, it's that idea of adjusting the trajectory of something. If you do it far enough away and you nudge it just a little, by the time you get further down the road,
it's the butterfly effect.
Yeah, it's much larger and much bigger. So you say, well, what difference does it make if instead of 42 games, Moses Fleetwood Walker plays 442 games? How much of an impact could that have had? Well, maybe if it were just him, no. But again, you mentioned his brother plays on the team. Yeah. Well, then suddenly teams go, wait a second, if this is okay, we know of a player over here who's African American who's really good. Well, and so it's this gradual steps. Each one are small, but if you move things up 20 or 30 years, then in my mind, a lot of the things that happen from a societal standpoint happen with generational change. Yeah. Where just what you're accustomed to, and so if you push back a couple of generations, where that becomes more the normal, the next generation tends to think of things slightly differently. And so, it's a small change, but when you play it out, that butterfly effect, which I think is a good way to describe it over time, maybe is very different. And if you have, even thinking about the way this interplays with other things, you mentioned black males having the right to vote. You're very clear in saying males having the right to vote, because white females during this period of time did not have the right to vote, which is... being a product of the late 20th century is still shocking to me, even though I'm a student of history and actually have a degree in political science, so I understand what was going on there. But imagine the scenario of more of a presence, not just in baseball, but baseball now being a reflection of society. That's an important thing to understand.
Yes.
The baseball part of this is one thing, but how this reflects what's going on in society and what becomes acceptable is maybe in the 1890s. By 1900, the suffragette movement is further along because of them looking and saying, hey, if there's a black catcher that's playing for that team in Ohio, why don't I have the vote?
Right.
This coming from the mouth of a white woman,
right,
who's looking at her rights under the Constitution. And so it's again, that butterfly effect, I think, is a good way to think about it, or just the impact that one thing can have upon another. I know I've read a number of the things that were said by Brooklyn Dodger fans in 1947. And again, I remind myself, these are New Yorkers.
Yeah. These
are not people in Atlanta or in Alabama that we typically think of, even in the 60s, are still pushing back against the idea of desegregation and integration taking place. But, there's Brooklynites who are not happy about the fact that the guy playing first base is black.
Right.
That by May and June, when he's playing really well and doing things for the team, have their mind changed about that. And then, again, using Robinson as the example here, because we have him as an example. A lot of people would point to the fact that we talked about this earlier, his character is a unique aspect as well.
Yeah.
During that first year, he's told not to fight back, to sort of just take the abuse, take it out on him by playing hard, not what you really want to do, what's even appropriate to do. But I know that even in seeing that, a number of his teammates who in spring training were Southern whites who were not excited about this. They were doing it because their boss, who signed their paycheck, told them you were going to do this.
Yeah.
By the middle of the year, as some of the abuse starts coming, for example, to Robinson that year, it's his white Southern teammates that are now standing up for him back to racists on the other team, because Robinson could not respond, but they could.
Yes.
And so, again, to your point, if you push all of that back in time, does it make a huge difference in 1890? Probably not. But does it make a bigger difference by 1900, by 1910, by 1920? I think the answer to all those questions are yes.
Yeah.
And so if you can move just a little bit back 50 years, where you are 50 years down the road, that butterfly effect has expanded out a great deal.
Because, too, some of the things that were specific to Moses Fleetwood Walker was that he was a guy who was well-educated, who had gone to school to study law, who studied religion and philosophy. He was into the arts. He was a very well-rounded guy. He later on became an inventor and an entrepreneur. And so having someone represent the African-American community who was someone who would represent what would later be kind of termed as the new Negro, someone who was very kind of urbane and refined and cultured. Having someone like that represent that community could have changed the way that people viewed African Americans at that time.
Right.
We see this is so often the case that it's very easy to be bigoted or to have discrimination or against someone or a group of people with whom you don't interact.
Right.
But so often when you get to know someone whose belief system is different than yours or skin color is different than yours, and you get to know them, you start to realize that you're probably not that different, and you start to see the humanity in the other person, and it becomes a lot harder to subjugate and worse to people when you actually look at them as other human beings.
Right. And that's why sport, entertainment, things that are in the public view much more than in the private view can have the ability to influence those things, because they're a common point. If for no other reason, in 1947, I know this because I've seen the documentaries, I've read the things that were there, I've heard the interviews. If nothing else was going on in Brooklyn in 1947, there was a conversation about race going on.
Yeah.
And the reason there was a conversation about race going on was because there was a African American playing first base for the team that everybody rooted for. Now, some of that conversation we wouldn't want to be listening to today because it was heated, and we would hear things that we would look at and immediately go, that's bigoted, that's ignorant, that's all the things we would label it from that generation. Although some of the things we would do that in that generation and that day would have been thought of as being enlightened, we would look at it and go now and go, well, that's not so enlightened, right?
Sure.
But what was definitely happening there was a conversation. And that conversation was happening because of that catalyst that was in the public eye. And so if you can move that catalyst back in small ways or big ways to other areas, when the conversation starts happening, things start happening.
Yes.
Sometimes for better and sometimes for worse, but there is a conversation. With the gentleman's agreement, no Moses Fleetwood Walker. When you go to the ballpark, there's no reason. Maybe you bring it up with somebody going, I know the Negro League team is playing down the road here. I wonder what's going on there today.
Right.
But there's no conversation about race in the same way that we saw it in the real timeline with Robinson, that we could have seen it with others that were
happening
moving
much
forward.
earlier.
And I can't help but think about now again, and Robinson was a quality player. He's a Hall of Famer for a number of reasons. He's a Hall of Famer because of obviously what he did breaking the color barrier. He's a Hall of Famer because he was a quality player.
His own merits on the baseball field.
Right.
Yeah.
Separate from that, separate from the social aspect, from the actual baseball play. But he was not, in fact, I looked at a number of lists of players, either Negro League players or players that eventually played in the majors. Robinson doesn't make the top 10 list of who some of the talent was, even of that day.
Sure.
You can argue that even of Robinson's day, Hank Aaron, also a Hall of Famer,
yes,
breaks Ruth's record until it's stolen by Barry Bonds and steroids, and we can talk all about that.
Yeah.
And a different thing, what would have happened if steroids had been not in the game? That'd be a whole other different what if.
Yeah.
But
some doors.
But the fact that that Aaron plays briefly in the major leagues, comes into the major leagues, and then actually breaks a very substantial career record, breaks Ruth's career record.
Yeah.
That's a sign that Robinson wasn't the best player. It wasn't all about the quality of his play; it was about the quality of his character. But also seeing that there was other talent that was out there as well. Right. And I also, even as I'm saying that, I'm thinking about in the '70s as Aaron is approaching that record,
the threats that he received.
Yeah, I mean, some of the, again, we want to think. We want to think even here in 2019 that we are more enlightened probably in some ways than we are. Things that we hold to being politically correct that people think but don't say. But Aaron faced death threats. He faced I was actually listening to an interview just the other day on a different podcast where they were talking about the fact that the commissioner of baseball didn't even choose to be there when he broke the record. And in fact sent there was a black executive in the Major League Baseball office who was the one that was there. So it was sort of sending, almost, if you will, I hate to use this terminology, but I think it's fair, sending the token black Major League Baseball executive to go and recognize the black player who's breaking a hallowed record that happened to be by a white player in the case of Babe Ruth. Yeah. So I think that's an interesting thing. And again, this idea of culture, not just baseball, could be very different. Yeah. So when you say the Harlem Renaissance, I am going to ask a question here also for my benefit, but for the benefit of listeners. What would most people know came out of the Harlem Renaissance in terms of something we would recognize?
Oh, well, a lot of good art and music. I mean, those are the areas I'm going to know a little bit better. So I'm sure many things outside of that. But Louis Armstrong was first making his recordings during that, I think really during the 1910s, but 1920s is really when he took off. Bessie Smith was another one, just a fantastic singer. And very similarly to how we talk about this idea of the new Negro, there's still music in the vaudeville era, 1910s, and I'm sure into the 20s also, that where you see performers in blackface and doing these Jim Crow parodies and that kind of stuff. But these were people who dressed very well and were excellent musicians, excellent at their craft, and demanded respect because of that. And so we hear a lot of great music coming from that era. I believe Langston Hughes was a big poet from that time as well. And generally it was a time to show that African Americans were not what they were so often depicted to be in the Jim Crow South, which were just these grotesque caricatures, things that were very demeaning, that they were, just as much as white people could, African Americans could carry themselves well and be respectable, be talented, hardworking, do incredible things in any field. And this was also a time, I taught college music classes too. It's funny that you talk about baseball and history because I taught a history of American popular music class, and it was the same thing. It's a history class, just told through the lens of music, because the history of music in this country is the story of this country. And you had a lot of clubs during this era that would play jazz music, because this was when jazz got to be the big thing. And these were clubs that were in Harlem, and they kind of started off as African American clubs, but gradually this is one of the places where you would see races start to intermingle, and in these, especially in New York, you would see a lot of racial intermixing and intermingling in places where, even though in a lot of the country it was still very segregated,
Right.
and blacks were still kind of looked down on, but because of the Harlem Renaissance and these great movements forward in the arts, it was something that kind of ushered in this area and allowed people to get together.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point to make in the sense that, again, as I was talking about, the fact that the conversations are happening, the fact that there's something that a white American and an African American can both look at it and both say, we like that. Now, now there's it may be a small thing, it may be that piece of music, but it is common ground.
Right.
And just like baseball, for a lot of folks, can be a common ground. One of my favorite movies of all time is Field of Dreams.
Yeah, great movie.
One of the things that's in that is talk about, not dwelling off of this too far, because we're not a movie podcast either, but this idea of the character, the protagonist played by Kevin Costner in the movie, Ray Kinsella, has a falling out with his father. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that they did before there's the falling out, and then of course what the movie is really about, it's not a baseball movie, it's really a movie about relationships.
Yeah. It's a fitting one to discuss on Father's Day.
We're recording here on Father's Day, but it's this idea of that was something that they had in common that they could always talk about.
Right.
And so you could be, in that case it was more of a generational difference, sort of the hippie 60s versus a more traditional way of thinking. So we can have different points of view, but if there's something that we can share that we have in common, mm-hmm. we now even have a reason to be talking about what we differ on.
Yeah.
And we can do so in a way that's not just about the differences. Okay, we can differ on X, but we agree on Y.
Yeah.
And that's actually an important thing that happens repeatedly in our society, be it, as you point out, music, mm-hmm. which is another great reflection of what's going on. Films and popular culture do the same thing.
Yeah.
Sport does the same thing.
Absolutely.
I know there are a lot of folks who are not sports fans per se in America that may not think of sports that way, but they think of them as being large money gobbling conglomerates now, which is also probably
which they can also be,
which is true, but there is a sense of commonality mm-hmm. that you see so often expressed around the common idea of sports. The thing that jumps to my mind is after the events of 9/11.
Yes,
a lot of, and it happens there in New York. It happens that the Yankees are one of the teams that year that's competing in the World Series. They lose the World Series that year, which there's still some people that still feel that somehow wrong in the big picture. But it was a huge bit, the culture, mm-hmm. which was centering around a lot of things, trying to digest what had happened there. Mm-hmm. The first game back on the field in New York at Yankee Stadium, baseball becomes a societal moment.
Yeah.
That's not about anything other than, it's not about baseball anymore. It's about a bigger thing.
Right.
That's true of Robinson in 47, and again, as we've talked about here, could have been true in other ways moving through with a different path.
And have you seen Endgame?
No.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Do you intend to?
I intend to.
Okay,
so,
I will hold off on what I was going to say, but there's a nice moment in there where sports become, I think, a bigger thing than just sports. It's a brief thing, but it's a nice moment.
It's important. So again, it may seem strange to, on an alternate history podcast, to spend so much time talking about baseball, and Ryan even slipped in a war there, by the way, is wins above replacement.
Yes.
If you need to run that down, there's plenty of stuff on the internet, but we're not going to pause and try to explain the idea of wins above replacement. For measuring a player.
As much as we would like this to just be a baseball podcast.
And maybe
I brought statistics. I looked up modern comparisons for his 1884 season, so I've got a lot of baseball stuff, but that may not be of interest to our general audience.
To the general audience.
Yes.
We may do a special bonus episode for those of you that want to look at Moses Fleetwood Walker. Let's look at the numbers kind of thing. A sabermetric approach to him. But I think it is relevant to bring that up and to say that a couple of things there, but talking about it's just baseball, but it's not. We know from 1947 it's not just baseball.
Right.
So in the 1880s, yes, it's baseball, mm-hmm. but it's not just baseball.
Yeah.
And so to think about things could be different. There's an interesting thing. Ryan, I really appreciate you joining us today.
Thanks. I appreciated the invitation. I've enjoyed being here.
Good. I hope to have you back on a subject of maybe that you'll suggest, or that the readers might suggest a subject that I'll say, aha, we need Ryan back, and we will do that. So once again, we thank you for joining us here today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast.
And if I can just slip in before you wrap up one more time.
Please do.
As you mentioned earlier, April 15th. Jackie Robinson gets all the credit. He did so many great things, and we definitely don't want to take that away from him. He wore the number 42. On April 15th, everybody wears 42. But 42 is also the number of games that Moses Fleetwood Walker played in the major leagues, the first African American to do so.
And even if you're not there on April the 15th, if you're in a major league stadium and look around, you will see somewhere where they have the retired numbers displayed.
Yeah.
You're going to see a 42 there. That's what it's there for.
Yeah.
Unless you're in Yankee Stadium and it's there for Mariano Rivera as well. But remembering when you see that 42, the exact same thing. And there was this guy that sort of lost to history.
Yeah.
That could have altered history, as we've talked about here today.
Right, and endured some very terrible things, just as Jackie Robinson did. So
when you see 42,
think of Robinson, but also take a moment
and think of Moses Fleetwood Walker.
Absolutely.
And if you're a Doug Adams fan and into science fiction, you can also assume that just means that's even another reason why 42 is the answer to life,
the universe, and everything.
So now that we've fully tied together all kinds of geeky, nerdy kind of things there for you there, hopefully you appreciate that. I appreciate you sharing that, because we talked about that earlier.
Yeah.
That's one of my takeaways from this experience, was I did not know that. Now every time I see that, I can't help but know that, and that's actually a good thing. Yeah. Sometimes, again, our perspectives get changed by what we know. Yes. And that's part of what's there. Yeah. So if you've enjoyed the podcast, we certainly ask you to give us some feedback on that. You can find us at our webpage. That's on the World Wide Web at aforkintimepodcast. Need to put the A in the front there, .com. That's a place that you can go and get episodes. It's also a place where we have a forum board. So for each episode that we record, this is all still new. As you know, we're still in the single digits here on episodes at A Fork in Time. But we hope that you'll actually go there and do a couple of things for us. Provide some feedback. If you like what you've heard today, do we want to hear that? Absolutely. Sure. If you don't like what you've heard today, do we want to hear that? The answer is absolutely. The very nature of a hypothetical of alternative history is that it is opinion. We hope it's opinion based and supported by fact, but opinions can differ. And so I think a great sort of epitaph to this episode is the idea that opinions do matter. The conversation matters. Yeah. So join the conversation there at aforkintimepodcast.com. On the forums, you can become a member there. You can subscribe to our newsletter. Lots of new things you can do. That's a new thing that we've got up and going. Excellent. So happy to have that in place. We'll also probably have, by the time we air this podcast, a little bio there for Ryan. And if he wants to put some contact information, if you want to send him something directly, you can do that. Yeah. Be happy to have you do that. Of course, on there you can also find links to other ways to connect to us on social media. My daughter, who's often a co-host of this podcast, Alexis, that's what she does for a living, is social media. So if I don't mention social media, I'm in lots and lots of trouble as we're recording here on Father's Day. So you can find us on Facebook and Twitter and on Pinterest. The links for those various things can be found in the show notes. They can also be found there on the podcast as well. Most importantly, we want to say thank you for the most generous gift that you can give, which is that of your time. And so you've given us the time today to listen to what we think. We hope that we've actually triggered and sponsored some thinking in your own mind, whether that's the same or whether that's different. So the last thing I do want to mention, sort of as we close out the podcast here for today, in addition to the things that you can find there at the website and the other things that are there, being able to go and support us at our Patreon page, if it's something you'd like to do, to be a patron for the program as well, is if you aren't already subscribing to the podcast on your podcatcher of choice, be that through, I keep wanting to say iTunes, it's Apple Podcasts now, they've rebranded that, or Google Podcasts, or Stitcher, or Buzzsprout, which is actually the size that we host our podcast on originally. Do subscribe, that way you don't miss an episode.
You're on Spotify too.
We're on Spotify as well, I think we're now set up that if you use a smart speaker, be that an Alexa or Google Home, certainly if you're set on the Google Home for Spotify to be what plays your music, I know that you will do that, because I did that on my own Google Home just yesterday, said play the latest episode of A Fork in Time, and then was both proud and terrified to hear my own voice coming back at me shortly after that.
That was not how you celebrated Father's Day. It was listening to your own.
No, that would be narcissistic at a minimum. But thanks for pointing that out, Ryan. You can also find us there. Also at those sites, there's a chance to leave reviews, and reviews are important because, again, we want feedback. Yeah. And that's also how, inside of the search engines and the other ways that people can find the podcast, that becomes an important part of what's there through ratings and reviews. So. Yeah.
I just had a thought, by the way.
Uh-oh.
Because something I didn't mention that I used to do was I was in a Tejano band
That's true.
for 3+ years. I'm a white guy. My name was El Güero. And what if Selena had never been assassinated?
Wow.
It could have been really interesting.
That's that has the feeling right now of a future episode in the making. In fact, I can see by the expression on Ryan's face.
I'm getting excited.
If we don't do it, he's going to do it and send it to me.
have to, yeah.
So look forward to that. That's a good point. So again, we thank you for joining us here on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. And actually, what we close out a lot of the podcasts for is actually stolen from Ryan's dad. It's stolen from Kenny when but he's stealing it from Yogi Berra. So
yes,
when you're stealing it,
credit where it's due.
Or if you're stealing it, give all 3 or 4 levels of the credit that goes back to Yogi Berra, the famous catcher. Since we're talking about baseball today, apparently once said, if you get to a fork in the road, take it. So we like to say, if you get to a fork in time, take it. Again, thanks for joining us. Have a great day.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Join us next time.